Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to ConTinual. This is a panel on paranormal romance, and I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. Jeannie, why don't you start that off?
All righty. I'm Jeanne Adams. I write urban fantasy, paranormal romantic suspense, and space adventure with my friend Nancy Northcott.
Nancy?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was to me, wasn't it? I'm Nancy Northcott, as has just been pointed out, and I write the Light Mage Wars Paranormal Romances, partly published by Grand Central and partly published by me. And those are paranormal romantic suspense with heavy fantasy elements. I also write romantic suspense and historical fantasy, the Boar King's Honor trilogy for Falstaff Books, which has strong romantic elements, and other subgenres of romance. And Jeannie and Gail and I are all in a romance anthology with our friend Seressia.
Speaking of whom, hi, Seressia.
Hello, my name is Seressia Glass, and I am, like Nancy said, in a wonderful Christmas anthology with these lovely ladies. I write contemporary romance and paranormal romance, and I've done some urban fantasy as well. Trying to get back into it because I miss it so much. So I'm glad to be with these ladies and getting to dip my toe back into the paranormal romance and paranormal fantasy world and the genre.
And
I was giving her a thumbs up because she thought to hold up her book, which put her ahead of me.
Good stuff. And I'm Gail Martin. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more. But as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. And so I've got my Morgan Bryce hat on today as I'm, chatting with folks here about paranormal romance. And let me kick that off by asking, how do you define paranormal romance? What does it need to have to be paranormal romance? Anybody who wants to jump in may.
I think it just needs to have something that's out of the ordinary or extraordinary for it to be paranormal. So that can be, psychics, things like the Good Witch series, as light as that or as heavy as, a Game of Thrones kind of a thing. Well, not with the body count and some of the other degradation of women going on things. But I think if it has that out of the ordinary extra thing in it, and that can run the gamut, which makes it great because then you can write about just about anything, whether that's ancient gods or love on a spaceship, any kind of thing like that, enhanced humans. It can run the gamut, and I just love that.
That's one of the things I love about it too, and particularly love that. I mean, of course, if it's romance, by definition, it has to have a happily ever after. Well, that's just wonderful because then you're not going to get surprised in the end by everybody dying, which is wonderful. To know that you're not going to read that and be incredibly disappointed and upset. So if it says romance, it's going to have a happily ever after. And as Seressia says, having all the paranormal elements, even as light as whatever you would like. I mean, there's a wonderful series by Madeline Alt, and it's very light and fun. And then there's some that are very, very dark. I mean, I know yours, I love all of y'all's books. So I know yours, Gail's, some of them touch on very dark, and some of yours too, Seressia. Actually, yours too, Nancy, can get very dark. But there's always that happily ever after to look forward to.
Well, I think what differentiates paranormal romance from various genres of fantasy is that the romance really has to be central to the storyline. It has to be the focus. It has to be what drives the story more than the external elements. And I think you can skate pretty close to 50-50, but you've got to have that romance in the spine of the book.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, on the paranormal piece, it can go so many different directions. It can be magic. It can be shifters. It can be supernatural creatures. It can be gods and demons and angels and curses and haunted things. It can just be ghosts. It can be all of the above. And that's one of the things I really love about it. It can be any time period. Because if you're just dealing with what makes a paranormal romance, then it's not the time period. It's not the type of pairing. It's that there is something that is other that is not of this world, that's supernatural. And that's what kind of differentiates it. But I agree with everything that everybody said. And that leads me into the next question, which is, what's the boundary line then between paranormal romance and urban fantasy? Because urban fantasy is known for having a fair amount of sex and romance in it. Certainly got woo-woo items in terms of, magic and supernatural. Where do you draw the boundary there? Anybody?
Well, I think, for instance, like the Jim Butcher's series, there's some love interest in there and some a little bit of relationship stuff, but it's maybe 10%. I mean, there are relationships in the book that are not love relationships, but in terms of a love interest or anything like that, that's maybe 10% of the book. So they're urban fantasy, very dramatic urban fantasy, and they're wonderful. I love those books, but I don't read them for the romance. And I pick up Seressia's book or Nancy's book or your books, your Morgan Bryce books, Gail, for the love story as much as I do. I mean, I love the way each one of you and so many of my favorite authors weave in those paranormal elements and make them part of the story, but I'm reading for the romance.
And I think with urban fantasy, it's more about your main character's journey and what their quest is and what they're trying to accomplish. And it can take 3 books, it can take 15 books. So that is the dominant storyline that drives that character forward. And along the way, they're finding, they may be finding love for the rest of their lives or love for right now, but the relationships aren't what define that person's story, that main character story. So it's kind of more heavy on, seems not necessarily heavy on the external versus the internal, because the internal can drive their story. I know with my heroine Kira, she's got a lot of baggage that she's unpacking as she goes through life. So which is a lot for a 25-year-old, but it's mainly in urban fantasy, it is about her trying to get her answers to her story versus her trying to meet the one person that she's going to go on that journey with. So there can be people in and out all the time, but the main quest of that character is what drives the urban fantasy.
The Bellador series by Diana Love is also urban fantasy, and it's very much about a journey like Seressia was talking about, but it has a much higher romance quotient than the Jim Butcher books do. And evals romantic relationships always play a role in the story, but it's not the focus of the story. It's just more of it. I mean, more than in others.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because I know in my non-romance urban fantasy, the stuff that's under my Gail name, the romance is important because you can't fight monsters all the time, but it's not the main focus of the book, and it kind of happens in between the other action. In the Morgan Bryce books, I'd say I'm closer to that 50-50 split that Jeannie was talking about, where there's a very substantial plot, and there may or may not be a quest, but 50% of the time people are working out their relationship problems and trying to figure out what they just did that made the other person walk out and work out all those issues to get that happily ever after. And oh yeah, there's sex.
Can't forget that part.
No. What do you think we're reading it for? Yeah. But, and that's really not true. That leads into my next question is, where does sex come in with making something romance, and where does it come in with paranormal romance? How is the sex?
Go ahead.
Well, I just think the whole thing about romance, you can have everything from the sweet, everything is behind closed doors, all the way to oiling it up and doing it on the first page. I was really trying to figure out how to say that tactfully.
Yeah, 13 here.
But the thing about the anything about the love story has to drive any kind of emotional connection has to drive the story forward, whether that's driving the story of what's going on with the paranormal forward or driving the story of what's going on with the people forward. And so, I mean, for me, sex is wonderful for me personally, but for the story purposes, it always has to drive the story forward. And that's what the thing I feel about either the urban fantasy elements or the magical elements, however that plays out. If it's just sort of window dressing kind of there in the back, to me, that's useless. It has to be an integral part of the story and drive the story forward.
But you know, that's a good point, because at one time when paranormal romance was first becoming a thing, you all may remember Lynn Curlin's Stardust of Yesterday, which was a ghost romance, and it kind of ignited that subgenre. Editors were going to conferences and saying, well, we'll buy your paranormal romance, but all these woo-woo elements cannot be integral to the story. You have to be able to strip away all the woo-woo and the story is the same. And I'm sitting in the audience thinking, if they're expendable, why am I bothering to put them in there in the first place? And so I think the genre has evolved a lot in the last 15 or 20 years, because they're no longer saying that when they go to conferences.
I have nothing to add to that. They nailed it perfectly.
Nailed it? Really?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just couldn't let that by. Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know, in the Gail books, one of the reasons I brought out the Morgan Bryce pseudonym was there's no explicit sex in the Gail and the Gail and Larry books. It happens behind closed doors. We know people are doing it, but we don't see it on page. And the Morgan Bryce books have explicit male-male sex, and I didn't want anybody to pick them up by accident and have a heart attack. So hence the pseudonym. But yeah, it has to matter to the plot, and it can't just be in there for titillation or just, hey, you know, way to get to the good part. The whole plot should be the good part, not just the very happy ending. But I want to come back to what you said, Nancy, about the evolution of paranormal romance, because we've all been, you know, reading it or writing it or at least watching around the edges to see what's happening for a while. So how do you mentioned a little bit about how you've seen it evolve in terms of the powers that be accepting those woo-woo elements. Any other thoughts about how the genre has changed since it's a fairly new subgenre?
Yes, actually, because we've now gone from the woo-woo has to be expendable and one couple, one book, happily ever after, to the woo-woo is vital to the story, and the couple's story can in fact stretch over multiple books. And so I personally like that. You know, there's some people, I think we've all met them, who really want happily ever after in this book, and then we move on from these people. We're happy to see them as friends of the hero and heroine down the road, but we're kind of done with them. And, you know, I enjoy those stories too. I pretty much read the gamut, but there's something nice about the complexity that can be built into the relationship when an author has more than one book. Nalini Singh would be a prime example with her Psy Changeling series and her Archangel series. Guild Hunter, I guess, is the series title. And Janine Frost with Cat and Bones and Night Prince. And I can't remember the name of the one she's got going now with Ian. It's like her newest one. But anyway, all those relationships evolve over multiple books. I think Guild Hunter's up to what, 10 or 12 by now, something like that. And so I really think that's a positive thing for the genre because it gives us more choices.
Jeannie or Seressia? Anything to add?
No, like Nancy said, it waxes and wanes. So it's kind of on this, at the beginning it was all just light. We don't know how the audience is going to react to this, and then something like Christine Feehan's Carpathians bust out. Then you have other people that are bringing their different elements to it. Even, you could say that the Anne Rice Interview with a Vampire started a lot of people on the love of vampires, and then there was vampire books everywhere you looked. So, and now there's and then werewolves and other creatures became big. And then it's just kind of, well, we're not sure what's going on now. And it just kind of, the pendulum swings on it. So I think that now it's, you have to have that, you have to grab the reader emotionally. And the best way to do that is by making the relationship of these two people, or two or more people, the most important thing that's happening. And of course, the way that you do that and build that up is with the intimacy, how they're starting to trust each other, how they're showing that there's nobody else but these other people that are important to them. So I think that all of that is what makes the romance of Paranormal Romance work as well as it does.
I couldn't agree with that. Both Nancy and Seressia, the points you made are absolutely perfect. I think too, one of the things that has been a huge change, though, as those of us have been writing for a long time, is when we got indie publishing came into the mainstream. There was no longer the gatekeeper of, well, no one will buy male romance, so there's no market for it, so therefore nobody should write it, and I'm not buying it, so nobody in New York would buy that, and it was considered a fringe thing. And when we got indie publishing, if there is a way for people to love, there is an audience for a story about people learning to love that way, or finding love that way, or accepting themselves enough to accept love. And I think that, whether it's couched in paranormal terms or it's couched in any term, has been an amazing and wonderful thing to see the growth of that, and to see people, the sheer volume of acceptance that has poured out. I've just seen it in terms of the male romance. There's so many readers who read male romance who aren't gay. They just want the good story. They want the story, the intimacy, like Seressia was mentioning. They want that. They don't care who the protagonist is or who they love. And I'm like, yes, we're finally getting somewhere.
Yeah, and I really enjoy what Nancy was talking about in terms of the established couples, because while I've enjoyed reading a lot of books where it is a one and done, okay, we've got this couple squared away, now let's go on to their cousin, brother, next door neighbor, whatever, and that's fun. That's always giving you the rush of new love. But at least at this point in my life, I kind of cheer for the established couples, because that's the hard stuff. Falling in love is the easy part. All right, now let's actually make a relationship. That's the tricky part. And if you're also doing it while you're fighting werewolves or banishing ghosts or beheading vampires, well, that adds a whole nother level of complexity. But I really like getting them together and then having them have to figure out where they need to fix themselves to be able to actually carry off this relationship, because to me that's the really messy, intriguing part. So, and I've seen a lot of that with Paranormal Romance. You were mentioning some series that had stood out to you. Pandora Pine's Cold Case Psychics, and Jordan L. Hawk's Wyborn and Griffin series, and Charlie Cochet's third series all have marvelous paranormal elements, very integral to the plot, but they're also focused on one or more established couples. And so that's really a catnip to me. And I've seen a lot of that in Paranormal Romance. So let's go back to those, the monsters and the magic and the ghosts. where do the creepy creatures come in? And do they need to be the love interest to make it paranormal? Do they need, where does that come in? You mentioned vampires and werewolves, shifters, oh my. What about the monsters? They need love too. So what do you think?
I like to write about all of them. I just think it's so fascinating, especially if it's something that it's not a European set mythology. So of course, for me, I've been long been fascinated with Egyptian mythology. So even my paranormal romances, The Sons of Anubis, that deals with jackal shapeshifters. So who are the sons of Anubis and protect the living from the undead. So there are undead zombie-like creatures in those romances, but it's also steeped in ancient Egyptian mythology. You've got Isis priestesses in it as well. To me, it's the best part about paranormal romance is that you get to explore a bunch of different, even obscure type mythologies and things, and you can bring a lot of richness to the stories by taking something that is kind of common or maybe not as common, and just do a little sidestep on it and put your own spin on that and making a new tale out of it. So and I've talked myself away from what the question actually was.
No, you didn't. Monsters needing love too, and how does that come in?
In the Shadow Chasers series, I have, it's all about light and shadow, but there's a lot of creatures that live in between. So just because they're a monster doesn't mean that they don't have a job, doesn't mean that they don't have bills to pay, doesn't mean that they're not trying to find love as well. So I like to depict them as everyday people. They just look a little different. So, but there's at the heart of each of them, for the most part, they're just trying to live their lives, and they're trying to be accepted as they are, where they are, and their journeys are about giving a little, getting a little, just to be themselves and be with the ones that they love and who love them. So I love monsters.
I love your books. I love the Shadow Chasers. I love the jackals. I just love them. And
those covers are amazing too.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
The monsters, though, I think that's one of the things that is so draws me in about paranormal romance, is that in the monsters that you write on the page, they wear their difference on the outside, and those of us are human seeming, we wear our differences on the inside. And the challenge being, how do we find acceptance? How do we find love? And to me, that no matter what the journey is that they're going on, I'll go along for the ride. If you can if that's the path you're going down, I'm going with you. And finding that, and I love too, like Seressia said, I love when it's like, okay, these are just people trying to get by, and just like anybody else, and you can resonate with that. Even if you can't resonate with the fact that they can suddenly go fanged or clawed, you can certainly resonate with the fact that they just really would like somebody to care if they came home at night or in the morning before the sun rose.
I really have nothing to add to that. I think they said it really well.
I think I probably got headed on this path way back when I fell in love with Barnabas Collins on Dark Shadows. And there was this, even though neither he nor, Dr. Judith were what we now think of as leading man, sexy, handsome, they were these two tortured individuals who needed to find each other, and Barnabas wanted to find his humanity again, and she was helping him because she obviously had quite a crush on him. And
didn't we all?
Pardon? Didn't we all?
Didn't
Yeah.
we all?
And I think that just always stayed with me, was that there's this sense of alienation that a lot of the quote unquote monster characters have, where we've all felt like the outsider at the party. We've all been the kid with the nose smashed up against the glass, wanting what's on the other side of the glass. And for the monsters, that's regaining or attaining that humanity, that ability to connect, and having somebody to love them despite their monstrousness, which is only a slight exaggeration of how I think most people feel of wanting to be loved on our bad days, which honestly can be kind of snicker monsterish, you know. Yeah, when you're hangry, it really isn't too far off from those Snickers commercials. So I think that's kind of the real world commonality, that when I'm reading a paranormal romance, that's what I'm relating to in the misunderstood werewolf or the vampire who wants to be loved, is that thread of essential humanity.
Well, and that's actually a theme that runs through the Guild Hunter series, is that Raphael's the archangel, and you wouldn't think of an archangel as a monster. But when, I never know whether the heroine's name is Elena or Elena, but when she first meets him, he wants to hire her because she's a vampire hunter, a guild hunter. And he's so cold and arrogant and unsympathetic. And through the course of the series, he becomes more human. And then further down the road, certain things happen that put that in danger. I'm trying not to spoil it for anybody, if anybody's going to go out there and read it. And so the whole theme of that has been kind of the nature of how power affects people and its effect on a character's humanity. And that's been really interesting.
I was going to say, people who watch Supernatural do know that angels are dicks, but moving on from that. What about the research that goes into paranormal romance? Because you've got this whole extra layer, whether it's curses or haunts or ghosts or vampires or ancient spells or predictions or prophecies. You got this whole other layer. How do you approach the romance in paranormal romance?
I mean, how do you approach the paranormal in paranormal romance?
I'm sorry. How do you how do you approach the research in paranormal romance?
Well,
diving down rabbit holes constantly. Well, for the Shadow Chasers and all of the other Egyptian themed stuff that I've done, I've gone to the Carlos Museum here on Emory University's campus here in Atlanta. They have a couple of permanent exhibits. Professor Peter Lacovera, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's done digs over in Egypt, so when he's done seminars at the Carlos, I've gone to attend those. I have a bookcase and a half full of research materials, a copy of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, some other curses and rituals and things. So some of the things that Kira does, says as she's doing her ritual, you know, with the weighing of the feather and things like that, that she does to check herself, those are actual prayers and curses that I've discovered online or in my research books. So it's fun, it's a lot of work, and you can get easily sidetracked and discover new tidbits. But that's what makes it fun, and then you get to decide what you can put in your books.
Well, I write mythology, so I don't use mythology the way Seressia does in her books. So I bought a couple of books on Wicca, a big book on runes, one on magical traditions around the world, one on candle magic, earth magic, crystals, and plants. I might be leaving something out there, but I did all that before I wrote the first book because I had the luxury of doing that because the book wasn't sold yet. So I didn't have a deadline. So I could take all the time I wanted to build this world. And I took a little from column A and a little from column B and a little from column C and 2 from column D and mixed them up the way I thought that they would work in the story. And so I took, as I think we all take, established tradition and then put a little spin on it and put our own stamp on it, as it were.
I don't have much to add to that other than that I've got about 3 or 4 shelves worth of books on magic and different traditions, from voodoo to root work to crystals to Wicca versus being solitary witches, witchcraft versus Wicca versus nature magic versus, I mean, I get books on all of them. And looking at different traditions, that the Witches Walk, the Haven Harbor Witches series that I created, they're all witches. They're a virtual town, not real, in Massachusetts. And so they have their own tradition of witchcraft. It's not Wicca, it's witchcraft rather than as an earth nature religion versus the contrived Wicca thing. So, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. I just mean that it's a very specific tradition, whereas this is a tradition more of witchcraft. And so they have grimoires and they have things like that. And I've looked at grimoires, and again, as Seressia said, this is a rabbit hole that's just endless and fun and delightful, but you do have to at some point stop and write the book. But there's endless fun there.
I love the research piece of it, and the rabbit holes are fun to explore because I love researching the location of any book, because that brings out all the cool things. And when you start looking for the hauntings in a certain area, or the unsolved cases, or the creepy things, and there are a million websites for all of that, you start getting all kinds of plot bunnies on, ooh, that sounds good, or oh, look, there's a haunted railroad tunnel. And so you start kind of fleshing that world out. But then learning about all those different traditions and mythology, you can now get grimoires for your ebook as well. Just downloaded a couple of ones from the 1700s that worked into one of the books. But there's so much fascinating stuff. And I always joke that, I really, really hope, for many, many reasons, but I can just see, if I'm ever under investigation for somebody's disappearance, I can hear the newscaster saying, police found a disturbing cache of books in her library about all manner of occult and questionable traditions, right there with the plants and poisons and all of those things.
Firearms books.
Firearms,
weaponry.
yeah. Murder gardens, vampires, and I'm going, oh yeah, I'm just totally screwed because. So, what got you into wanting to write paranormal romance? I admitted my Barnabas Collins crush. What was yours?
Well, for me, I started reading sci-fi and fantasy way back. Ursula K. Le Guin, Marion Zimmer Bradley, some of the the big one whose first name starts with an M, and I can't believe I'm forgetting, the Pern Dragon Riders, Anne McCaffrey. Oh Lord, slap me for that one. So I started reading those, but I've always been fascinated about people's journeys and their journey of acceptance and love and loving themselves and finding other people to love. So reading those, and then reading historical romances, which also seem like fantasy to me because I had no frame of reference for some of the historical romances. So for me, that's how I kind of started that, and just always been, fascinated with Sabrina, the Teenage Witch, some of those stories like that, and then just kind of going deeper and deeper in fantasy and reading about the magical systems and just kind of wanting to put my own spin on it. That's pretty much how I started.
Well, I love those color fairy tale books, the red fairy book, the blue fairy book. Growing up, read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, but I love comic books and I love superheroes. And it's very hard to sell a superhero romance. I mean, it's hard to sell a paranormal romance, or it was at the time, but it's even harder to sell a superhero romance. If you look, there are not very many of them. And so I decided to write mages because they're like superheroes. They can do things regular people can't do. And I think Seressia put it really well with exploring people's journey and their path to making peace with their inner demons and their inner struggles, because I think at bottom, romance is a genre of healing. It's about healing the problems in your soul so that you can commit to another person or other people, if that's the type of story that we're reading. And that always appealed to me. I mean, I love stories where stuff blows up and spaceships zip around, and that's all great. But I also love stories where people come to terms with themselves. And romance does that like no other genre, I think.
I agree. The earliest book I can remember being read to me and reading was a book called The Blueberry Pie Elf. It was written in like the 20s or 30s. It was something that my mother had. And it had a princess and a dragon and 2 or 3, like a whole family of dragons. And so from the very first memory, I wanted to have a dragon. So if there was anything in the library that had a dragon in it, I was going to read it. So that sent me on all sorts of pathways, and Middle Earth and Middle Sea and anything else that had Susan Cooper, and anything else that had knights and dragons and strange creatures. And so as you get older and you think all the great stories, it doesn't matter really what motivates a story, there's a relationship in it. And for me, the stories that were most intriguing and most caught me and that I thought about and remembered and shaped me were stories about people falling in love and what trials and tribulations they had to go to understand each other and all that. I mean, you know, like Nancy said, I like things that blow up, and I like spaceships zipping around, but there's nothing like that cauldron of conflict that comes with, I'm in love with you, but I'm not sure I even like you. And how can I live with somebody who's a werewolf? I mean, how do I reconcile this with my day job? And, you know, all of those things just make such an intriguing tale to me that I wanted to put that on the page. I wanted to be part of that gig.
Yeah, I think for me, in addition to the whole Barnabas Collins thing, I fell very hard for Camelot and all of the Camelot mythology. And I was reading it for the Morgan Le Fay and the Merlin and the magic. I mean, yeah, there was the whole triad with Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere, who really could have just saved the kingdom if they'd have worked out an arrangement.
Seriously,
Seriously, look, guys, we can destroy the whole kingdom, or we can just kind of work things out. Now I think we'd have that alternate Camelot story, and the kingdom saved. But I loved all the paranormal aspects in that. And then I read Mercedes Lackey's The Last Herald Mage series with Vaniel Ashkefron. And Vaniel was just so real to me. And
Yeah.
that whole love that transcended death and time between him and Stefan really just grabbed me. And I did read a fair amount. You mentioned Madeline Alt. I did read a fair amount of the cozy paranormal mysteries that have that underlying element of romance, and enjoyed those because they had magic and they had romance, and this was all good. And then, as I've often said, I watched Supernatural and fell totally down that rabbit hole, started reading fan fiction, started reading Slash, came up and said, wow, this is good. I wonder what the published stuff looks like. Said, wow, this is good. I got to get in on the fun. And Morgan Bryce was born, and now we're like 15 books later. But that's how it happens, is something just grabs a hold of you, and next thing you know, you're writing books. So what do you see as the future of paranormal romance? As Nancy brought up, we've come a long, long way. Where do you see it going?
I don't know if, I haven't I've been at this a while, but not too much with paranormal of late. So I don't know if it's going to be big again in traditional publishing, but I think that because of indie publishing, we're going to be able to create our own little worlds and find readers who love those worlds. I mean, you ladies have been independently publishing for a while now, and you probably can speak to it better than I can. But you know, it's not going to, you know, traditional publishing. They're not really known for being breakthrough, taking a risk type people. When it comes to some of these things, they'll wait till somebody else does it, and then suddenly they want 35 books that are just like that one. But I think it's us, the hybrid and indie authors, who will keep paranormal romances going and thriving, and then, you know, those successes may get publishers back into it, because, you know, it is cyclical, and it'll probably come back around, and somebody will do a new take on vampires or shapeshifters in some different new way, and people will be all back into it again, mainstreamly. But I think for the most part, indie's gonna keep paranormal alive, and I think that's great, because we're kind of unfettered and unchanged, and we can do what we want that way.
I couldn't agree more. I think that traditional publishing will keep publishing the paranormal romances that they know will sell, and indie writers and indie publishers will innovate, and something that, as Seressia says, something that starts small will get big. I don't think it will ever go away. I think we as human beings are way too fascinated with things that go bump in the night, and with the senses that we don't quite admit we have, to ever let it go completely away.
Well, I agree with everything that they said. And I'd also like to point out that I think that's true of a lot of different genre fiction categories. Like, for example, romantic suspense, the genre where stuff blows up and people have romantic relationships in between. New York is still buying those, but they're buying them. They want this kind. They don't want that kind over there. And so that opened up a gate for indie authors, some of whom are making a lot of money writing romantic suspense that doesn't fit that pigeonhole. And so I agree with what they said about paranormal, but I think it happens across the genres, because the marketing department runs the traditional publishers' selections, and they go with what's safe, which is understandable when you consider the corporate emphasis on profit and loss on everything.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that is that indie publishers don't need as many sales as a New York publisher to make a book very profitable. New York has to sell a huge number of books, and a New York author who's getting a tiny fraction of that in royalties has to sell a huge number of books to make a go of it. But the margins are different, the percentages are different in indie. So a small but excited audience for a subgenre can keep that subgenre and those authors very busy for a very long time, and happily so. So that definitely lends itself to experimentation. I think we've really seen an embrace of the male-male romance from people across the board. And that's brought people into saying, well, what else is there? And so we're seeing different types of pairings. We're seeing a lot more diversity in terms of gender and orientation, and types, the different types of ways people connect with each other, and what counts to them as a happily ever after, and what that looks like, instead of having it kind of all look the same in the end. And that's really opening up, like Jeannie said way back at the beginning, a lot more expanse of what you can explore, of what it means to love and be loved, and what a relationship looks like, and what that ideal is. And that's really exciting, because while you're getting to that happily ever after, it doesn't necessarily look like your mother's happily ever after. And that's pretty cool. we are already at the end of the hour. So ladies, tell us where people can find you online. Jeannie, go ahead.
Oh, okay. You can find me online at jeanneadams.com. You can find me on Twitter at Jeanne Adams, where I spend way too much time. You can find me on Instagram at JPA Griffin and on Facebook at Jeanne Adams Author.
Seressia?
If you can spell my name, you can find me online. I'm on Twitter at Seressia, on Facebook, Seressia Glass, and also very sporadically with pictures of my dogs on Instagram, Seressia Glass as well. And of course, my website, SeressiaGlass.com.
My website is nancynorthcott.com, and I spend probably more time on Twitter than is good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott on Twitter. On Facebook, I'm Nancy Northcott Author, and I guess that's it. That's me on social media.
My website for Mail Paranormal Romance is morganbryce.com. I'm on Twitter at Morgan Bryce Book. I'm on Instagram as Morgan Bryce Author. And I'm on Facebook as The Worlds of Morgan Bryce, which is a reader group, but I'm mostly there on my profile, which is Gail Martin. And I'm on Pinterest as GZ Martin, which also has a board with about 15,000 supernatural pins, as well as a board for my Morgan Bryce books and backgrounds and locales and inspirations. So I'm pretty easy to find if you can remember the name. And that's it for tonight, ladies. This has been fun. I love talking about paranormal romance. I wish we could meet up in the bar and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us. And of course, this is ConTinual, and we've been talking about paranormal romance. Stay tuned. We're going to have more coming up soon on paranormal romance and different angles of that. But check out everything that ConTinual, the ongoing online convention that never ends, has to offer. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.